If you come into that clinic and that person is stepping away, then you are losing a huge amount of intangible value. And I think that's something that people often don't quite give as much kind of thought to. It can be the best clinic in the world, but if the owner wants to step away from the business almost on day one or very quickly, that's not the sort of business that we're looking to work with. Often, if you go back 10, 15 years, that person would have actually been the natural person to take over. But unfortunately, due to kind of wider economic issues, it's much harder today for an individual associate to actually buy the clinic. The big win is on the overheads. So at the moment, it gets very granular, but you can almost break it down on your rent side, divided by the number of patients that are coming through the door, and then you almost have a rent cost against the individual. We prefer very much to focus on revenue growth opportunities rather than cost-cutting synergies. But if there are easy ones, then of course you take them, but it's very much focused on growing the revenue from there, and then that balances out the kind of margin side of the business.
Great. We're here with Ollie, who is leading the M&A charge at Kinetico, which is a group that is currently acquiring new MSK practices. You'll tell us a bit about that. This is part of a Business of a Clinic podcast where we think about how to scale, exit, create value at the site and group level for private healthcare operators. So, Ollie, thank you so much for being here. Do you want to do this quick intro?
Yeah, of course. So my name's Ollie. As you said, I'm the Director of M&A now at Kinetico Health. So I've been in the M&A space for coming up to a decade now, which feels like a long time, which is really nice. And essentially, I'm in charge of managing the partner onboarding process. So that's from origination, which essentially means finding new clinics, going through the list of characteristics that we look for, whittling them down because there's over 10,000 clinics plus across the country. So that's obviously a very wide pool. And then meeting with the potential partners, taking them through the onboarding process, so the full legal process, supporting them on the financial side as well, and then bring them to completion, at which point I tend to hand over to the integrations team.
Very cool. I'm curious, when you were growing up, did you want to be a director of M&A for a healthcare group? Like, how does one find their way into this kind of work?
Yeah, to be fair, I stumbled into it in a sense, but I think in the dental industry, which is where I started, I think that's actually quite commonplace. So I had done a law degree, but really didn't really enjoy it, unfortunately, which happens. But I had that legal experience. Dentex, which was the dental group that I ended up going to join, they were looking for a paralegal to support their head of legal and also the transactions team who managed the due diligence process. So that was how I originally joined. And the good thing about being in the legal team is that you get to see the full scope of the process. And as someone who didn't have a strong understanding of dental clinics, how they work, the CQC, which is the kind of regulatory body for those who don't know, it was an amazing schooling because you touch on every single part of the practice. And that's something that I'm still doing now, but for an education piece, it was completely invaluable. Then after I'd been with the company for just over a year, an opportunity opened up in our M&A team. It was something I was having a lot of interaction with, also working very closely with the partners, which is probably my favorite part of the job, I'm sure we'll touch on. I put myself forward for that role. Fortunately, I was given it, and then it's just basically been a learning process and onwards and upwards from there.
Okay, you said it's your favorite part of the role. I've worked in clinic. I've seen and been ringside and in clinic transactions. When you say it's your favorite part of the role, can you take us deeper into what does that actually look like for people who don't know the world of M&A transacting around clinics?
Yeah, so to be fair, when I said my favorite part, it was more in terms of working with the partners. I'm very fortunate in that I love my job. When I wake up in the morning, I'm really excited to come in. And even though it may be small things like from the beginning of the process, let's take it from when you've actually signed the heads of terms. So that's the point at which you enter into exclusivity. And from there, you're essentially a partner in waiting. So the full process is that we do an element of financial due diligence. So that's something that when someone is preparing for a sale, typically what we'll review is the last 3 years worth of accounts to get a good understanding of how the clinic has been performing up until the point at which we start to take a look. But the unfortunate thing with that is that, let's say the accounts end in March and we're reviewing in November, you have a bit of a gap. And what we want to do is always look at the clinic performance as close to the point of completion, because one, it gives the best reflection of how the clinic's actually doing now, but it also means that post-completion, when we get to integration, it's nice and smooth. So normally you're doing an element of financial, we then do commercial due diligence at the same point, because prior to engaging the lawyers, we think it's important to get two of the major pieces out the way. Everyone can be aligned, make sure that for the partner themselves, everything's in place and they want to move forward, and it gives us a more in-depth understanding of the business that we think we're buying. So the commercial side covers essentially the clinical performance. So it's things like the hours that the clinicians are available, how many patients are coming through the door, where those patients are coming from, things like that. And once those two pieces are ticked off, then that's the point at which we dive into the legal process. That for the partners is probably the hardest piece, because everyone knows if they dealt with any sort of transaction, whether it's buying a house or whatever it may be, the legal process can be quite difficult. There's challenges that always come up. But at that point, we are very committed to the deal. The partner that we're going to be working with, they tend to be very committed to the deal. And it's all about staying in touch, making sure that we're working together on any issues that may arise as a team, because that's what we'll be doing moving forward as well, and just trying to overcome those challenges. So often it can be things like there may be an issue with the lease. There may be only 3 years left, and we won't take on a property that only has 3 years left because of the risk that involves for the clinic and the stability of the business moving forward. So often you're then trying to extend that lease, and then you're getting into dealing with parties that sit outside of the transaction itself. And so that's where it can become a bit difficult. But we had a opportunity recently with a clinic that we were working on, and it was a lot of us working in parallel with them to make sure that things were staying on track. They were in touch with the landlord. They had a solid understanding of what we were actually asking of them, and the landlord did too, because often with these clinics, you're dealing with kind of a landlord that may only own one site or two sites, and they're also not as used to an M&A process. It's a lot about partnership and a lot about also educating the partner as they're joining, because we really do our best to make sure that the actual due diligence process isn't oppositional, because I think often people go into those processes and they think that it's kind of us v them, and then when you complete, that's when you start to work together. And obviously if you're going into a deal on that basis, if you're going into a long-term business relationship on that basis, it's not the best footing to start on.
It makes sense. And I imagine raising capital or acquisition in general, it's a very strange dynamic to go from we are adversarial and then suddenly everything completes and now we can love each other and we can work together. Relationships don't form that way. So I think that makes a lot of sense. When I think about the process you just outlined, it feels like at each stage there are the do's, the don'ts, the what to look for, the skeletons. I'm really interested in pre-legal components, not because the legals aren't important, but because I think as a business owner, as a clinic owner, when you're thinking about how do I create organic value at the store level, at the site level, you're thinking about that outside the context of lawyers. You're thinking about like, what do I do in order to be value optimized for an acquirer if you're thinking about selling? So I'm quite curious. You set out a few things. You said, where do my patients come from? What hours do we work? What's my patient flow? Can you take us one level deeper without giving away the secret sauce on how you think about deals? But when you look at Clinic A and Clinic B, at a high level, they look exactly the same. Say annual revenue is the same and site is roughly the same. When you start to dig in and understand more about what's actually happening, what are you looking for? Like, where are the landmines? Where are the golden eggs? What are you trying to figure out? As an example, I know that a huge consideration for acquirers is, does 80% of my store value live with a single practitioner? That's obviously an issue, but even one level below that, what kind of mechanics in the business are you looking for that tell you, hey, this is a goer, this is interesting, let's move forward here, or actually, you know what, not for us, thank you very much, no show?
So the first and most important thing for us is always the clinic owner. So what are they like? What are they looking for? What do they kind of look for in their team? How do they want their team to come to the clinic? Culture is massive for us. It's something that I really found from the previous business I was in is a huge, not only point of differentiation, but when you look at the clinic moving forward, I know that you asked for pre-acquisition, but this for us is really important because if the culture is right, the team are really committed to their principal, they really like them. If you come into that clinic and that person is stepping away, then you are losing a huge amount of intangible value. And I think that's something that people often don't quite give as much thought to. And so that's one thing that for us is a massive thing. We need the principal to stay on board. We need them to be there for a certain period of time. We want them to remain committed to the business. That doesn't mean that they're doing the exact same responsibilities. And I'm sure that we'll touch on kind of the stuff that we take away from the principal. But we do want them there physically on the ground, still remaining as the clinical lead, but just hopefully with a huge amount of that operational burden taken off them. So that for us is always the main starting point. It can be the best clinic in the world, but if the owner wants to step away from the business almost on day one or very quickly, that's not the sort of business that we're looking to work with. And then when it comes to the other key pieces, like you said, what we call key person reliance, or essentially having a large amount of the revenue sitting with individual performers, we're going to walk away from it. And particularly in dental, you can't do that because if you're looking to acquire the best clinics, very often the principal will be generating 25% of the revenue, 50% of the revenue, even slightly higher, but they may still be some of the best clinics in the country. You can also give yourself enough time to prepare for that succession plan. One of the big benefits of MSK, slightly less true in podiatry, but in general, is that the individual practitioners tend to be generating a much smaller amount of the pie. So again, for us, if someone's doing 20%, 30% of the revenue, it may not be that we have to move on, but a really important part of that conversation will be succession planning. And that's something that we try to clear off even before we get into the offer stage, because we need a committed partner that's going to work with us. And going back to the cultural element, we always like to promote from within. So very often the clinical directors will have kind of the next generation of person in mind. Often if you go back 10, 15 years, that person would have actually been the natural person to take over. But unfortunately, due to wider economic issues, it's much harder today for an individual associate to actually buy the clinic. So what we offer to those individuals as well is the opportunity to get that leadership, get the skills that they may not be able to achieve otherwise, and work really closely with people who specialize in the operational side of a clinic, teach them all the sorts of metrics that we look for, how we look to generate growth, stuff like that.
Okay, super helpful. So one pillar, the who.
Yes.
Who's the principal? Who's next in line? How strong is the cultural fabric of the clinic? All that makes sense. And I remember very strongly being in clinic operator mode. And when you have the right team, life is good.
Yes.
And when you don't, it's a huge problem in a way that I don't remember ever feeling in any other professional context, because I think it's an embodied craft, right? Hands-on. You're working, not like in a restaurant. If you've got the wrong people working together in a kitchen, no food gets out the other side. So I think there's this collective flow that happens when the team is right. So one pillar of the, what are we looking for is the who and the fabric and the netting between them. Let's talk about patient body. What are you hoping to see in terms of patient mix, patient performance, PVAs, retention, acquisition, CPLs? Do you even look at that when you're thinking about acquiring a clinic?
Yes, we look at that as best as we can. So it depends on the quality of the data that's being put into the practice management software on the ground, because if the data's not there, we can't necessarily look at it. And that also tends to be something that happens post heads of terms being signed, because rightfully clinic owners don't necessarily want to share all of that information prior to us actually having something signed and in place. But yes, those are very much the sorts of things that we're looking for. So when it comes to patients, we want ideally as much recurring revenue. So patients coming back through the door, because one, it provides stability. Two, it points to the quality of the service, because although new patients are amazing, they're very difficult to capture. So if you have a kind of mechanism in place or the marketing scheme in place to bring people through the door, that's an amazing thing. But then if they're not coming back, that speaks to wider ongoing issues on the ground as well. But in terms of the structure of the revenue, so back to my dental days, my business that I worked with was very much privately focused. So we wouldn't touch NHS contracts. So although that is guaranteed recurring revenue, it wasn't one that we would want to prioritize. It wasn't the sort of demographics we were looking at either. So then you flip that back to MSK. There's very little NHS contracts coming through the door at most clinics. There are some, but it's few and far between. But what's much bigger is insurance. So very often we see insurance as a kind of way to maintain the people coming through the door. So you may look at a clinic, particularly in central London, they may be closer to kind of 70, 80% of the revenue compared to elsewhere in the country. That has pros and cons. The pro, again, is stability. It's guarantee to an extent of revenue coming through the door, but often you're getting that at worse rates. You're not generating the same level of profitability. So there's also that side.
For pay or blend. You want to see self-pay, insurance, 50-50, whatever the numbers might be. You have a view of what an acceptable payer base looks like.
Yes, and it does chop and change, as I said, depending on the location.
Sure.
But yes, that is a very important thing for us as well, because there's also what's known as stroke of the pen risk. And that comes down to, again, the NHS contracts is one example, but let's say one of the major insurance providers decides that they're going to put away from physiotherapy or whatever it might be. If you are very heavily reliant on insurance, then that leaves you in a very tricky position.
So you're looking at, and I don't know this about MSK, so you're looking at a patient body of 10,000, I'm making the numbers up, and what you're looking for is some kind of distribution in the payer base, which says we're not overly exposed to anything that isn't self-pay. If you're overly exposed to self-pay, presumably you're not upset about that. But if you're considering 50% of the pie is insurance blend, you want to see some kind of distribution in that insurance blend so that everything doesn't sit with Bupa, everything doesn't sit with Axe, whatever it might be.
Yes and no. I know it's not the perfect answer, but one of the things is interesting is different providers pay different rates. So you're giving the same work. So again, it's nice to have a bit lessened risk almost by having the separate providers. There is also that kind of balancing act of one may be paying £55, one may be paying £50. And so it kind of depends on the sort of mix. So it does chop and change quite heavily.
So can I get helpfully or unhelpfully tactical for a minute? So I think one of the challenging things, I've never run an MSK clinic. I was in medical aesthetics dermatology, and one of the things that is very true of medical aesthetics dermatology is that number one, it's largely elective, so you don't have the same sort of insurance presence, but also the transaction value on a single visit is substantive. And so the footfall is less. In MSK, you have shorter visits. In some cases, you have group visits. In some cases, the mix is a bit different, but the value of a single appointment is considerably higher than it might be in MSK. Obviously, in MSK, you have recurring visitation over a 2-month period, so maybe it stacks up if you get them there for that run. To your point around patient retention, super important. If you're looking at a single visit value of, say, £70, I know there are some premium MSK providers that are charging £150 per session. Let's say it's £75 per session. It's £35 cost per lead, £30 cost per lead. I'm making the numbers up, £25 cost per lead if you've really tweaked the marketing. So you've got £25 cost per lead, you've got £75 cost per visit. So you're looking at headroom of £50, plus you've got practitioner cost inside. Yeah. Where is the margin in some of these sessions? How do you make that work? And this is your problem.
That is essentially the kind of golden question, really, isn't it? Because we are all about margin improvement. That's one of the main things that you want to do. Very often the margin improvement is actually on the revenue side. So the more that you're able to grow revenue against a relatively stable cost base, that's where you're growing the profitability. So although most likely if practitioners are self-employed, you're paying them a stable percentage of commission. So the gross profit can remain fairly consistent. The big win is on the overheads. So at the moment, it gets very granular, but you can almost break it down on your rent side, divided by the number of patients that are coming through the door, and then you almost have a rent cost individual case. So on those stable costs, if you're growing the revenue really quickly, but that base is staying fairly stable, then that's where you're growing the profitability. Because a lot of people think that when a buyer comes in, particularly like a private equity buyer, for example, we are not a private equity buyer.
I've heard that before.
It's an important thing because I did previously work with a group that had some private equity backing, and there's pros and cons to that, but there's very much a kind of almost stereotype in the market that private equity come in, they cut all your costs, they get rid of people, and then they take on the business from there. And it's essentially taking a really good business, stripping out some things that, although on the P&L they look better, for the long-term stability of the clinic, for the reputation, for the patients, they're not good. We prefer very much to focus on revenue growth opportunities rather than cost-cutting synergies. But if there are easy ones, then of course you take them, but it's very much focused on growing the revenue from there, and then that balances out the kind of margin side of the business.
Okay. So let's talk about revenue growth for a minute.
Yeah. Of
course. We're in that. We're also in that business. And in cost cutting, but we're talking about revenue growth. So I was on a call this morning with a clinic owner, MSK. Actually, 2 calls this morning. One was with a clinic owner, 1 flagship, 2 satellites, flagship concession, whatever you call it, and then one that was single flagship. The former, I think, probably does about $500,000 in turnover. The latter does 1.1, 1.2. Very similar problems, different configuration of delivery, 1 site, 2 sites, whatever it is, but ultimately they're pretty lean. And actually what I have found in speaking with MSK providers is that they are relatively lean on cost because they are dealing with this margin issue. So I think there's a training there, unlike sometimes in medical aesthetics where we see practices are actually a bit looser on cost, supplies get up and walk away, because I think there's more breathing room inside of the gross margin position is a bit more flexible. But anyway, in MS, we found it to be usually a bit more disciplined on the bottom line. When we look at their performance in the patient body, one of them had, in a given month, ballpark 85% of their patient mix was returning. The other one had 72% returning patient mix. And when we benchmark across all of our clinics, we usually see that high-performing MSK clinics will have between 88 and 92% returning patient mix, to your point, recurring revenue, not necessarily dependent on new patient flow. Without sharing the secret sauce, are there no-fly zones for you? For example, your patient mix is 50% new, 50% recurring. No good for me. Is there anywhere in that spectrum where you say, you know what, hey, this is a non-starter for us, or there's too much to do here?
So that sort of information, I know it's not the best answer. It's quite tricky to verify. So very often it's coming from conversations that you're having with the sellers rather than necessarily getting fully into the detail like I'm sure you are with your clients. Right. But for us, again, it depends on the reasons for those things. And are there, based on the conversations that we're having with the seller, ways that we can work with them to improve the patient retention, to make sure that the patients that are coming through the door are then sticking? Because one of the things that we in particular as a group are really strong at is the marketing side of the business. So we are every day getting new patients through the door. We're seeing a huge increase in that kind of standard patient base. And so one of the big challenges that we have is making them stick. So when we look at a clinic, if they're getting patients through the door, but they're not sticking, we have great experience in fixing those issues. So I can't think of a specific example off the top of my head. And as you said, on individual clinic basis, it's maybe closer to keep some of our cars a little bit closer to our chest. But on a kind of high level view, with the operational background of our team, those are the exact sort of things that we are thinking about. We're sat in the office every day, talking as a team. What can we do to get these people to stay? What are the strategies? How do we work with our practitioners? Because that's often a part of it, is that practitioners sometimes see the process of getting someone to stay with them or take on an extra treatment almost like a sales process. And that's something that I've seen across the board in healthcare, is that you get into healthcare to help people, to fix people. And often it can feel like like I said, like a sale when you're trying to convince someone to come back through the door or to take on this extra treatment that, although for them as a person, it's the best thing for them to do, sometimes you can feel a bit uncomfortable actually having that conversation with the patient. And so that's something that we very much work with our practitioners on, and we're continuing to work on that because it is an evolving piece to make sure that they understand the best way to have that dialogue with patients, to make sure that before they even leave, maybe they're trying to make that next booking for the next stage.
Can I be controversial for a second?
Of course.
So let me first be uncontroversial. I think you're absolutely right. When you're a healthcare provider, there is no sale you're not convincing someone to do something, or you shouldn't be convincing someone to do something that is not genuinely in the best interest of their healthcare outcome. Full stop. No matter what you're doing, respiratory physician, pulmonologist, same thing, neurologist, whatever it might be, physiotherapist, chiropractor, dentist, the patient is expressing a desire. I don't want to be in pain. I want to recover. I want to look a certain way. I want to feel a certain way. The job of the healthcare provider, I believe, is, okay, great. How do we help you get there? Or how do we make clear that is perhaps not the right bar and that the expectations don't match reality? And we actually have a practitioner up in Edinburgh who's a wonderful practitioner, runs an incredible clinic, integrated dermatology, private GP, aesthetics, etc., like a wellness vibe, which is very cool, in a beautiful facility. And he regularly turns away patients. And the reason he turns away patients in the consultation is because he says, hey, you're expressing a desire to look and feel a certain way. And in my professional opinion, making these changes or undertaking these cosmetic activities will not necessarily get you closer to feeling that way. It's an exterior rather than an interior thing. So question mark on whether or not you also played a role as a practitioner of quasi-therapist in that conversation. But I guess in MSK, people are in MSK because they're experiencing some kind of ailment. And so they want to be on the path to not having that issue anymore. And so I think you're absolutely right. How do we help you go from I am in some kind of pain or discomfort to I am not in some kind of pain or discomfort? My professional opinion is do these 4 things, come in these 5 times, and then hopefully you're better. And if you're not, we reassess. So I completely agree with you. No sales, purely discovery, purely how do we help you get there? And I've seen this 150 times in the last week, and the way is 1, 2, 3, 4. Makes sense. But we, and I'm sure you do as well, we see an enormous amount of patient data, particularly around appointment activity. And while it is very much the practitioner's job to frame and hold that conversation in room, when that patient walks out the door, I think there are 2 camps of thinking. One is it's still the practitioner's responsibility. They need to follow up. The other camp is, how could you possibly expect a practitioner to follow up with 5,000 people or 500 people or 50 people while they are also seeing their patients, dealing with their day-to-day? That is not a manageable workload. And we've seen in MSK more than in other healthcare verticals that we work with, there's this legacy school of thought of you need to own your patients. If you came in and saw them, or if they came and see you, when they walk out, if they're on next appointment, that's on you, practitioner, to do that. So actually, that practitioner is stretched hour to hour, and in the 45 minutes that they have free between 2:15 and 3 p.m., turns out the patient doesn't want to answer the phone because they're at work. So how do you balance, from an operator perspective, that responsibility? Where should that sit in your view? It's interesting in dental as well. Are they different in dentistry? Because I know in dentistry, a lot of the recall work is done at the front desk as opposed to by the practitioner equivalent. So how do you think about that?
Very good question. I followed the path of the practitioner should be not necessarily going into this is what the price is going to be or whatever else, but I think it's really important that the practitioner feels comfortable and confident to talk about the, like you were saying, the actual goals of the patient and getting them back to the point at which they feel healthy, they feel active, and that is on them to explain to the patient, this is the best way in which we're going to do it. So it's not necessarily about kind of forcing the patient to have an understanding necessarily of the finances of what that treatment plan is. For the practitioner, it should be about this is just the best treatment plan.
The journey. Yeah.
And then, like you said, the people on the front desk, the front of house, that's where we then are looking to get them to actually action those appointments, get the patient booked in. But if they don't book in at that point, then again, it sits with a mix of the front of house, the practitioner doing an element of chasing up their own patients, but again, with the limited hours, that is a bit more difficult for them to do. And then also harnessing some marketing tools so that we are able to follow up with the patients at the right touch points, meeting them in the right place as well, to then try and make sure that patient's actually coming back through the door. But the best thing to always do is make sure that they are signed up for an appointment prior to them actually exiting the building. Because once they've exited, it becomes much more of a kind of difficult pathway exactly to actually get them to rebook at that stage.
Yeah, interesting. One of the things that we've seen also in dentistry, one of the biggest differences, we talk a lot at Coherent about this idea of leakage. drop off? Where are you losing patients? You're doing all this work, marketing, acquisition, intake, to get someone through the front door. How do you keep them there? Patients are not bad actors. Very few of them are bad actors. They are very susceptible to life being busy. And so even myself, I work in healthcare and I've worked in healthcare for a while. I am definitely overdue for a dental hygiene appointment. There, 0% question on that.
Yeah.
I'm absolutely overdue. Now, granted, I brush my teeth very well, and I don't think it is a priority, but also I'm not wooed back into the clinic because I get a very snippy email that says, do not reply. You are due for your recall. Please come back in. So I'm not motivated to go and do that for obvious reasons. But I think one of the places that we see a lot of drop off in higher volume practices, which I think MSK naturally falls into, but in other practices as well that are just higher volume because they're bigger, we see the same thing, is around two places. The first one is what we call first visit integrity. So this is people who book an appointment but never actually show up, plus people who book an appointment and only show up once and don't have a next appointment. So single visit integrity. And the other one is around cancellation management. So we see in high volume practices that the average cancellation rebooking rate is around 50%. Whereas in lower volume practices or in different verticals where you necessarily have lower volume, it's usually closer to 12%, maybe 13, 14%. So you've got this priority of rebooking people before they leave, makes sense, but life happens and they cancel. Then you're in the dance.
Yeah.
So how does that look like when you're thinking about this organic revenue growth at the store level? How do you layer on those processes to build? And as a practice that's thinking about selling to or joining the partnership, Kinetico Health, what are the top tips for them? Hey, think about these weak points in your journey because that's really where you're going to create value.
Ideally, you have almost like a pipeline of patients that you can then drop in, because that's something that we've seen quite often is maybe you'll have a patient on a waiting list or they phoned in, they cancel because they can't make that day, but they've said they're available for this one. So then when you get to your next cancellation, ideally you have that kind of next patient waiting in the net, because then they can flow through and take it really easily. But that is one of the biggest challenges. And that is something that we've seen in the data that we're tracking is on the day cancellations. They're obviously very tricky to, yeah, exactly. They are very tricky to fill. And then you almost have buckets, I should say, where you have like the 1 to 3 day, 3 to 5 day, or 3 to 6 day, and then 7+. And we're seeing really strong backfills of the patients on 7+. And then the closer that you get to 1 day, it obviously gets much more difficult. But the 1 to 3 day rebooks that we're getting after a patient cancels, they've actually been surprisingly strong. So again, won't give the actual number, but based on what you were saying, we're actually seeing stronger refill rates than maybe that you're seeing. And I think, again, it comes down to how warm can you keep your patient base in general? Are your patients coming back? Because if they're often coming back, then it's much easier to fill those cancellation spots. In terms of people who just don't show up on the first visit, there's not much you can do, because there's kind of tactics like you take a card and then there's an automatic penalty, but that friction that creates is really difficult. And then also the fact that the kind of reputational side is an understandable thing to do. But if I'm a patient, I want to go to a clinic, I do cancel at short notice, which you shouldn't do, but then I get fully charged. Next time I have an issue, then it may negatively affect whether I go back to that place or not. But the really good opportunity that comes with being the clinic owner practicing themselves, they have an amazing relationship with their community. And that's something that when I come into the clinic, I see it firsthand. It's amazing how much you can pick up on just the way that someone says hi to a patient, or whether they know their name. And then when they come through the door, whether the receptionist knows if they like tea or they like coffee and things like that. And that's one of the big differences that I've seen in terms of an actual M&A process between dental and MSK, because 95 of my dental visits were always in the evening. So they were very conscious of confidentiality, which the MSK practitioners are as well. But it was just a slightly different attitude and slightly different level of access. And I've really enjoyed, since moving over to the MSK side, being able to go into a clinic, see it in action, And when you're talking about some of the kind of sense checking that we're able to do, because we're going in whilst it's active, we are actually getting an amazing picture of team culture, the way that they deal with their patients as well. And also, to be fair, how busy it actually is. Because if you walk into the clinic, and essentially then it's a bit of a warning sign, but if you walk in and it's a really bustly reception, people are happy, you get a really good kind of sense of the vibe and what it's like every day.
Yeah. So you're probably one of a handful of people in UK private healthcare who have consciously made a decision to go from dental, which in some ways is almost its own world. When I see some of the pictures coming off of dental conferences, it looks like a holiday party in the sense that everyone knows each other and there's a vibe and you're either in or you're out or you're cool or you're not. And quite high school, which was not a criticism. It just shows that there's a fabric in the community and it's a very established market. But you've made a decision to say, you know what, I'm going to leave and I'm going to go here. I'm going to go to this underdeveloped or less developed from a corporate perspective, M&A perspective, part of the private healthcare market. What motivates that decision? Why and why now? You could have done it really any time. Why now?
So there's a couple of different reasons. The why now is probably the simplest one to answer. It was essentially that I'd reached a natural checkpoint. So I joined Dentex when we had, as I said, kind of 10, 12 clinics. I went through that whole journey over the course of close to 6 years of seeing us go from a small, pretty much unknown group in the marketplace, because as I said, at the time that I joined, you had kind of my dentists that were 500 plus, you had Bupa that were really active, you had Portman who are now still the legacy, but we are the kind of Portman Dentex group, and there's some other smaller consolidators coming up. And I got to this point where I'd been through the journey and I felt like I was ready for a bit of a change. The market there is now, it's a mature market. It's been running for kind of close to 30 years. People may not realize that, but that's how long the dental consolidation has been happening for. And obviously it's ramped up heavily in the 2010s, which happened almost across the board with these industries, because one of the big reasons why so many groups got into buy and build was because of 0% interest rates. There's a much larger, maybe for a different day, meta conversation around that, because leverage then becomes really important for post-sale values. But I felt like I'd seen so much, and it felt like if I went to a different group, one, it was going to be quite difficult on a emotional side, because I am a very sentimental person. I am a very I'm a very loyal, very attached person in general. And I had a huge amount of emotional investment into Dentex. I loved what we were doing. I really valued what I felt like as an M&A person I was giving to the partners who were selling to us, because they were at a point in their journey where the clinic was getting passed on, whether it was to us, whether it was to someone else, whoever it was going to be. And I felt every day, like when I was walking through the door, I was facilitating their journey to giving the best possible legacy to their clinic, giving the best opportunity for their practitioners moving forward, and also giving them the kind of work-life balance that they were looking for. And in dental, I felt like going to a different group, I wasn't necessarily going to have that same feeling that I'd always had at Dentex and then latterly at Portman Dentex. And that for me was really important. And I felt like getting a fresh change of industry, despite the fact that you spend so long building relationships and connections, and you're nurturing leads that can take 3, 4, 5 years to come to fruition. And I was slightly stepping away from that. But I felt like I was ready for a new challenge, and I wanted to move into an industry where there wasn't these kind of large structures in place. Like a small example, and I apologize if I'm jumping around a little bit, is the agency side of the market. So when you look at dental, there's multiple really large, really mature dental agencies. And so they're generating a huge amount of leads for you. Over half the leads that I was looking at were agency leads. And I felt like I didn't necessarily have the opportunity to build an organic pipeline from the start. or target the clinics that I really wanted, because you're almost getting overwhelmed with all of these leads, and they're amazing leads, and it makes the journey from meeting a practitioner to completion much faster, which when you're building a group that is going for really large scale is really important. But I think that's a really important skill to be able to develop. And I think for a group like ours at Kinetico, where we are not doing a volume play, quality is the most important thing for us. Getting to a stable group of 40 and a patient timeline, where we're also going to be developing some Greenfield sites as well. So it's not necessarily 40 acquisitions. I felt like going into a space where I would actually get the practice at doing that was really important. And I could also see that corporates, although I hate using that word, they have a really dirty reputation across multiple fields. And that is because people have this image, like we were talking about earlier, of groups coming in, completely restructuring. And to me, that never made sense, because why go and buy Clinic X for a really high multiple, really high price, when you're just going to rebrand and change it into a vanilla generic clinic that anyone could have started, anyone could have founded? You're losing a huge amount of that intangible value, the kind of loyalty of the patients, the loyalty of the team, by stripping all of that away. And like I was saying earlier, I think in the MSK space, there is now a really strong opportunity for sellers to find the right home for themselves. And when I met Claire and Yoni, who are the CEOs of Kinetico, for those who don't know, I really got that strong, passionate feeling. I could see how much they enjoy working with the partners that they work with. I could see how determined they were to grow the group and make it the best place to be. That's one of our, if you go onto our website, we have our mission and values. And one of our missions is to be the kind of place of choice that practitioners want to come, that partners want to sell to, and their patients want to come into. And going to not an entirely blank space, but a relatively blank space to be able to build on that was just hugely attractive to me. And like I said earlier as well, I did an MBA, and I wanted the opportunity to actually go and utilize a lot of the skills that I had learned, and going into either a more mature market or to a larger company, I wouldn't get to have the impact that I now have the opportunity to make for myself. So for me, those were kind of large reasons why I wanted to change. But then at the end of the day, fundamentally, although they are different industries and the leads are different, they are very similar. The service that they provide is different, but the motivation for getting into healthcare, which I'm sure you've seen, is consistent across the board. The desire just to kind of take a patient, fix them, give them back the life that they had is incredibly motivating to practitioners. And that's one of the things that I always find when I go in through the door, is you really get to see that passion. And very often, like the term is kind of entrepreneur by accident. They open their clinic, it's been running for 20, 30 years. And very often they don't even kind of take the time to pause and look around and see, oh, all of a sudden I've got a team of 15 and we're generating £1 million worth of revenue, and I've got this massive building. And they then get to a point where they're ready for partnership. They're ready for someone to work with and support them. And I am very lucky to work for a company where I feel very passionate about the fact that we are that best partner for them. And so being able to go into an industry where it's slightly less consolidated, it means a lot of the larger legacy, top tier, 5-star quality clinics, they are still out there and available. And it's about just connecting with those people and giving them the space to get back a bit of time, but also give them the opportunity to refocus on what they actually like doing, which is spending time with patient on beds rather than looking at spreadsheets, to pardon the slight pun there, but it wasn't necessarily the best one. So yeah.
It's interesting so first of all, thank you for sharing. Any decision like that is a personal decision ultimately. And it doesn't feel like you've gone from apples to oranges. You haven't gone from apples to roast beef.
Exactly.
You've made a small change, but it's an exciting change given that unique perspective of, you've seen it a bit from higher consolidation, higher maturity. Now you're seeing it a bit from lower consolidation, lower maturity. There's going to be a Venn diagram there, right? There will be, to your point, there's going to be some similarity. There'll be 20% difference on either side, but there will be 60% overlap of the two circles. What are the top 3, top 2, top 1 things that a dental practice leader should learn from an MSK practice leader, and vice versa, the top things that an MSK practice leader should learn from a dental practice leader? Now, granted, the right people to answer those questions are, of course, the MSK practice leader. But from your perspective, from a transaction perspective, from an M&A perspective, you have looked at, spoken to, learned from dozens and dozens of practices that have gone on to sell in dentistry, and you're now in the process of building that pattern recognition at MSK. So not necessarily from a clinic operator perspective, but from the conversation that you've had, if an MSK clinic owner and a dental practice owner sat down across from each other and they could each give each other one piece of advice with respect to building and scaling and exiting your clinic, what do you think that one piece of advice would be on either side?
So because of the maturity of the market, dental practitioners, when they get to the point that they are thinking about either retirement or selling, they are much better prepared because they've seen tens of their friends over the course of multiple decades have gone through a sale process. So they understand what that looks like. They understand, for the most part, what those exit opportunities are going to be. And they understand the timing at which you should be going to do that. A lot of people just think, oh, I'm ready to retire, so I'm going to sell now. And they are losing a lot of the value that they'd be able to take out of the business if they had actually prepped themselves for sale kind of 5 years earlier. So that's one thing that the dental practitioners do, much more so than MSK practitioners from what I've seen thus far. And the other thing that they do as well is they get prepared for sale. So it's not something, again, even though it's 5 years down the line, they'll think, I'm ready to sell, I'm just going to put my feelers out and go to the market. They'll be doing things, they'll be getting their accounts in order so that when someone goes to look at it, they're going to be nice and clean and ready. They will have spoken to their friends who have gone through the process, so they'll know this is often going to be a hiccup. So what can I do in advance to prepare for that? Is exactly to kind of navigate the difficult parts of the journey. And it's completely different in the MSK space because people are naturally thinking about, oh, I'm going to have to stay on board. And if I want to get the maximum value, these are the things that I need to be prepared for. So I do think that dental practitioners, if they were sitting down to speak with someone who is pre-sale,
Get ready.
basically get ready, get an understanding of your business. And if there's also anything that you can do in kind of the 6 to 12 months building up to a sale, building up to that moment to reshape the business, almost get operationally prepared, that I think is something that's hugely valuable for an MSK practitioner. And I would always say, do your research. I say that to absolutely everyone, and I'm very confident that a dental clinician would say the same to an MSK practitioner, because although someone like myself or someone comparable goes through the door, they hear everything about Kinetico and it sounds for them an amazing place to be. It may actually be that if they spoke to someone from a different group, for whatever reason, it may actually be a better place for them. And to be honest, we would rather see people go to the best home than just sell to us and then eventually find out within 2-3 months that actually it wasn't the best place. So I would speak to people that had already sold. We are what we call 100% referenceable. So we're more than happy to give details of existing partners, let you speak to them. And again, dental clinicians will strongly recommend that people do the same, because speaking to someone who's been in your shoes is always the best thing that you can do. And then to flip it on its head, what an MSK practitioner would likely say to a dental practitioner is to reduce the reliance on yourself. So that may not necessarily be in advance of a sale, because I do think lifestyle-wise, dentists put a huge amount of pressure on themselves almost, because if you're going to step away because you want to go on holiday with your family for 2 weeks and you're generating 60% of the revenue within a business, it makes it much more difficult for yourself to actually be able to get some of that space. And I think that's one thing that we see in MSK, because people in general, at least the scale of the clinics that we're looking at, because I should say that's important. If you're operating a 2-room clinic, then the revenue concentration is obviously going to be much higher. We, in general, look for kind of 7, 8, 9, 10 rooms. And so you get the benefits of that scale. You get the benefits of more practitioners in the room. So I do think that's something that as an MSK practitioner, they can look back at the dentist and say, that's one thing that I would advise you to do, even if it's not for building towards a sale, just as a lifestyle and also community side of it, because that's also the other massive benefit that people often overlook in groups. If they are operating correctly, they provide you with a community, because very often you can feel locked in your room, but you can get that on a smaller scale by having a larger team, because then that gives you people to bounce ideas off, that gives you people to ask for advice, and that also gives you a bit more cover. If you, for whatever reason, you have to step away, there's other people in the clinic that may be on short notice, on a day's notice, they can step in and fill that void.
Got it. It'll be an interesting dinner conversation. Back and forth. Yeah, you've said it out loud now, and I completely understand why those are the pieces of advice that would be given. Dentistry has that maturity. There is almost I'm at this stage of my journey now. Let me go gather the data on what the next stage looks like. It's very available. And in many ways, the market has been educated, as you were saying. In MSK, whenever we speak to an MSK clinic leader, the thing that they always love to talk about is how much time they went on holiday last year. And it's because the best clinic owners found a way to reduce reliance on themselves as that sort of core revenue engine. Last question for you. You're at the relatively early innings of the Kinetico Health journey. Feel free not to answer if this is the inside. Use the number 40. I think right now you guys are 7 now. It's come on quite a way from the early days. So you also use the word, these are your words, not mine. You also use the word Greenfield. So there's going to be a collage of Greenfield, owner operated, the right place for forward thinking, independent. I get the brand is clear. It makes sense what kind of practitioner goes there. What is priority 1 for your existing portfolio? You've got 7 clinics under management or that you're partnered with right now. They all probably have slightly different things that they're working on. But if you said, you know what, I've got one mandate, the thing we are going to focus on as a group for the next 6 months, it's this one thing. What is that one thing? By the way, I'll take it back. That's your strategy internally. You don't need to share. Don't share that. What I mean is you've got 7 practices. What is the advice, the nudge, the steer that you keep leaning into to help the practices reach their full potential? This is not your strategy. This is your observation from the conversations you've had. Nothing tactical, but what sort of nudging, where do you feel like you can lean in and give the most help, not just to your group, but just to those listening, other practices you might work in the future? This is the linchpin move for you in the next 6 months is to move this number from here to here. What is that number, or what is the movement that you need to see?
Fantastic question. And I think it's interesting because you'd probably get a very slightly different answer from everyone. So hopefully this is the right thing. But what I would say is providing the continued foundation for growth moving forward. So very often, a huge part of our job, particularly at the stage that we're at, as we're starting to grow the volume of clinics that come through the door, is integration. Integration is a huge part of building a group. It's very important to make sure that the clinics are all aligned in how they operate. There are big differences, particularly because we have physio, we have chiro, we have osteo, we have podiatry, and they all operate very differently. But what we can give them as a central body is really solid foundation so that the clinicians can then focus on doing what they do best. And so that is probably the number one most important thing that we can do as the kind of central body, the partner support center, is make sure that these clinics are getting integrated as quickly as possible into our system so that they then have the foundation they need to grow, retain patients, get the patients through the door, all of the things that we've discussed in like the last hour or so. If we do the work that we need to do on the integration side, build the house up from there. So that's what I would say is the most important and also most consistent thing across the group.
Magic. Ollie, thank you so much for coming in, sharing your experience. This is Ollie with Kinetico Health. Really interesting to hear about the journey from dentistry to MSK, and a really exciting next 6 to 12 months for Kinetico Health, I'm sure, given the pace of growth and also the focus on those foundations. So thank you so much for coming in.
No, thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Pleasure. If you're interested in learning more about Kinetico, follow on LinkedIn.
So we have Kinetico Health is our LinkedIn page, and you can also go to our website. We've got some testimonials on there from practitioners, a bit more information on what life as part of Kinetico looks like. And for those who may be interested in hearing a little bit more about potentially partnering with us, there's also a page on there which has a little bit of information about the journey and, of course, contact details. So if you do want to get in touch and hear a bit more from me or someone else in the team, the details are all there. And if you drop us an email, we'll come back to you as soon as we can.